So welcome everyone. We are so happy to see you here today to attend the workshop organized by Probatech. So I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to, again, Innovation Forum. I guess you might know it by now, but just wanted to say a few words about our branch in Lausanne. Okay, Innovation Forum is a grassroots innovation network and pre-seed accelerator and is a global association. In fact, we have branches worldwide. The association was born in UK and then developed in Europe and also beyond. All the branches of the Innovation Forum are affiliated with top level universities like the University of Cambridge, Oxford, and of course in Lausanne, PFL. All our activities are possible thanks to our sponsors. Mainly Johnson & Johnson, Marks & Clark, Kelty, LifeBeat, and of course all the other sponsors that make our events possible together. Also at the local level in Lausanne, we organize events in partnership with companies and sponsors. APFL is a sponsor of Innovation Forum Lausanne, as the association is affiliated to APFL. We also partnered with the Venture Lab that organizes accelerators for more developed startups. And at our local level, we organize prizes in collaboration with the Swiss Next Boston, the International Startup Award, and Start Lab. This is the team that made this event available to you today, together with, of course, Probatech, the main organizer. So we have here me and Eleonora. We are the co-president of the Lausanne branch. And together with the team, we organize multiple events throughout the year. Here are just a few examples of what we did in the past. We organize every year an annual conference on a topic according to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So, for example, last year we organized the annual conference on materials for sustainability. We also like to organize smaller events at the intersections between science and arts. So, for example, we organized an event about digital photography and how to quantify beauty. Together with these local events, we coordinate with the central team to organize the ImagineIF Accelerator and the Leaders Conference Health Horizon, where the global finals of ImagineIF will take place. So, thank you all for participating to our accelerator. We are so happy to see you here today, and good luck to all the applicants with the mentorship program and local finals approaching to everyone. So with this, I would like to leave the virtual stage to our sponsor, Probatech, and let him lead the workshop, Navigating the Maze, Finding the Shorter Route to Your Next Milestone.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thanks for the signal. So thank you all again for being here. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar called Navigating the Maze, Find the Shortest Route to Your Next Milestone. If you can just excuse me for 1 second, I'll just need to check something. Please accept my apologies for the delay. I think a washing machine in the background does not work very well for a webinar like this. So as I said, this is titled Navigating the Maze, Finding the Shortest Route to Our Next Milestone. And I'd just like to start by setting the scene. So healthcare innovation is experiencing a renaissance, and I believe this is happening for a few reasons. One, being new scientific and technical discoveries. Two, being cultural changes, meaning that entrepreneurship and starting a company is now considered a viable career choice. And three, renewed attention on science and technology. And obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated all of these. And I believe this actually extends beyond healthcare, so it affects all of your businesses. Unfortunately, there's no promise that you won't still be faced with some familiar issues of competing for limited funding, meeting technical challenges, and struggling to find partners. So my goal for today is to help you to overcome these challenges. And by the end of this webinar, I hope that I'll be able to show you how you can reach your next milestone more quickly. And although a lot of my talk today is framed from the healthcare and pharmaceutical perspective, actually the main concepts will be applicable to all of your businesses. Some of it may fall into what you might refer to as business development, and some of it may fall into what you may refer to as market access. By the end of this talk, I'll share 3 eye-opening secrets, 3 frameworks that will help you to use these secrets, and 1 extra tip at the end. But before we move forward, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions just to get us into the mindset and remind ourselves why we're all here. So first of all, I'd like to ask, why did you decide to start or join your company? And you should see some questions spring onto your screen now, some potential answers, and please feel free to select all that apply. So it may be to solve a problem for myself or someone I care about. It could be to help others. It could be to make money, for adventure, as a learning experience, to be your own boss, or other. And please feel free as well to drop some comments in the chat if you have any, or any answers that don't fit into the list here. Okay, so we have about 80% of votes in. So that is a really interesting result. So a learning experience is the #1 result. But then we have quite a good spread across being your own boss, adventure, making money, helping others, and solving a problem for yourself or someone that you care about. Okay, next question. What is the #1 thing that you hope to get out of the Imagine It Pre-Accelerator? So we'd all hope that there are several things that you can get out of it. But in this case, I'd like you to choose the #1. So we have the cash prize, we have the chance to meet investors, we have the chance to meet partners at larger companies, there's help reaching a technical or scientific milestone, and there's help building a team. And again, please feel free to mention any comments in the chat. Okay, good. So we have about 80% of votes in. I'll just share the results there. Hopefully you can see them. So we have quite a spread again, but the number one is the chance to meet partners at larger companies. Number two, we have in joint place, actually, the chance to meet investors and the cash prize. And then we also have help reaching a technical or scientific milestone, help building a team, and we have a few other options too. Okay, so that's very interesting to hear, and thankfully many of the concepts in this webinar help to achieve some of the same aims that you've mentioned there. So one idea that I'd like you to take away from this webinar is that your access to information can determine the way that you proceed. Information determines when to invest and what to invest in, and this can include investments of both time, money, also effort. It can determine when to partner and who to partner with, how to compete, how to communicate, and when to quit. So I'll reiterate that your progress is determined by your access to information. And before we go into the details, I'd like to give a bit more of an introduction to myself and my company. So my name is Aram, and initially I started my career by gaining a healthcare perspective. I trained as a pharmacist and completed my training in hospital and practiced for many years in the community sector. Then I sought the research perspective. I got a PhD in small molecule drug discovery at UCL. And then I wanted to see the commercial side of things and became a strategy consultant, working for 6 out of the top 10 pharma companies in the world, but then several other large and medium-sized pharma companies and sometimes other healthcare companies. But through all of that time, I started to think about why so many healthcare issues lack solutions today. And I felt that a lot of that was due to various factors leading to potential solutions not being explored to their full potential. And that's kind of the impetus behind founding Probatech. And at Probatech, we help teams to understand their environment so that they can understand their most impactful next steps. Several years ago, I was a PhD student, hoping I could find a cure for African sleeping sickness, a really debilitating and fatal disease. Unfortunately, I didn't fully understand the resources, the time, and the other things that can take to get a drug from idea to the clinic. There were grant applications and there were rejections, and predictably, things went nowhere. And this scenario is all too common, and it can be frustrating for the researchers. But actually, when you look at it from the societal perspective, it affects us all, where we lack solutions for healthcare problems, or we lack products and services in all spheres of life. And in pharmaceuticals, if we think about how this is interpreted by the layperson, I can give you some examples of things that I've heard in the past. Do you think pharma companies have discovered the cure to cancer, but they've hidden it to keep making money? The reason there is no cure is because pharma needs something they can profit from: illness. People are smart, they have ingenuity. If they wanted to develop better drugs, they would. And it's like a conspiracy. Pharma profits from sickness. Pharma is only profitable if people remain ill. Pharma suppresses cures. Pharma markets substandard drugs. But I believe the truth looks something more like this. On the left side of this funnel, you can see the drugs that go from the idea stage and are tested in the laboratory. And then if you look at those and consider the number that make it through that funnel and through the stages of clinical development and onto the market, only 0.5% of them survive. And if we look into other industries, the shape of the funnel might not be as stark as this, but amongst many of the figures I've heard around how many startups survive, you often hear quotes such as 60% of startups fail within 3 years. And that can be a problem because small and medium-sized enterprises or startups, in many cases, are the engines behind new discoveries and new ways of doing things. So why do new companies fail? Often there are technical challenges, and that's to be expected in any high technology industry. But one of the most common reasons is running out of money. And another of the most common reasons is a lack of business development. And that's going to be one of the biggest focuses of this webinar. So as I promised, there are 3 secrets that I'd like to share with you. Number 1, you need to understand value as perceived by your stakeholders to be able to communicate value. Partnerships can shorten the route to your next milestone. And what you see is all there is, and that refers to the need to keep track of the competition and staying one step ahead. And before we get into the details of these secrets, I'd like to go back to that concept of information. Now, some of you may be familiar with the idea that we are in the information age with all the digital technology, the way that we communicate, the way that things are valued, and the way that daily life runs. And a big figure in the information age and in information theory is a man called Claude Shannon, who came up with the idea or understood that any message can be broken down into its principal components, such as noughts and ones or binary digits. And with those principal components, you could use them to construct any message and deliver it perfectly. Now, another one of Shannon's ideas is that there was this architecture of information, where on the one hand, you have an information source and a transmitter, and on the other side, you have a receiver and the destination. So why am I telling you this? Well, first of all, I'd like to make the point that healthcare innovation has always been about information. If you think about the way new innovations in healthcare are tested, shared, spread around the world, we've often relied on protocols, on publications, and on patents. And I put healthcare in brackets there because I believe this is relevant in several different industries. But the other thing that I'd really like you to focus on is this idea that what you as the information source transmits about your product or your offering may be received in a different context by your stakeholder or the destination in this case. So you need to think, how does your offering translate into a context that's appreciated by your stakeholders? And that leads us to our first secret: understanding and communicating value. And you need to understand how your stakeholders perceive value, how you can deliver value, and how you can demonstrate that value. And a useful framework for taking advantage of this is something I call value-based communication. And first, a couple of questions here. So first of all, why is starting a business hard? And I believe one of the main reasons is that you need to connect your offering to value as perceived by another person. And it's not always clear how that value is perceived. And why is starting a new healthcare business really hard? And that's because you're dealing with multiple stakeholders at once. So this idea of value-based communication asks the following questions. Who are our stakeholders? What do they value? Why do they value it? How do they recognize value? And through asking those questions, you should understand how you can communicate that value in a language that they can understand. And in my experience, first of all, I got pieces of this through experiments, the literature, grant applications, and rejections in academia. In consulting, it was more about the companies, their vision and their goals, their drugs and vaccines or their assets, the various stakeholders in the pharmaceutical industry, the evidence they had to produce, the regulation, the access to markets and revenue. But underlying all of this in different areas of life, to bring context to it, I kind of noticed the same patterns of questions. Who are the stakeholders? What do they value? Why do they value it? how do they recognize value? And how can I communicate in a language they understand? And I found during my time consulting that the companies that did this well tended to have a clearer path forward. So to reiterate, you need to ask, who are all the stakeholders? But here's a tip to make this easier. You can narrow that list down by asking who are the most influential stakeholders. So who is going to determine whether your product or offering is actually used or not, or whether you're able to reach that next milestone or not. And then if possible, try and seek those stakeholders out. You need to ask, what do they value and why do they value it? And you can actually gain a lot of this from the available literature, from the industry press and other publicly available sources. But the richest source of this kind of information comes directly from the stakeholders. And then ask, how do they recognize that value? And I really urge my clients here to look specifically for what they would want to see. And in high technology areas, especially in healthcare, there's often some form of evidence or maybe a particular experiment that they would like to see. And through all of this, again, you can understand how you can communicate your value in a language that they can understand. Let's see how this might work in practice. So from the first thing I would like to say actually is that pandemics are not black swan events, although that is being said a lot these days. But the black swan is the idea that after having seen 1,000 swans, you don't expect the black swan because all the other swans you've seen are white, whereas pandemics aren't really like that. In fact, they seem to be occurring every few years now. So now that I've got that off my chest, I would like to tell a story about a time during consulting when I was consulting for a Fortune 500 pharma company during the Zika pandemic several years ago. And the scenario with COVID-19 is feeling very familiar to me because back then there was also a race to develop a Zika vaccine. However, all of the players recognized how risky this activity was. Not only was there unlikely to be a return on investment, but it was not clear whether they could recuperate their losses by investing in a Zika vaccine. So there is a lot of competition for limited funding sources from governments or from supranational organizations. So the main point here was the main task here was to go out, identify the stakeholders, understand what they valued, why they valued it, and how you could demonstrate value. And by understanding what these various funding sources wanted, our clients were able to align their R&D strategy appropriately and then communicate the value that they demonstrated in their program back to those funders in order to secure that funding. And I hope that with what I've mentioned here, you're able to take the same approach yourselves if you're not already doing so. Okay, so now another question just to make sure everyone is still awake. What is your number one challenge at the moment? You should see the questions on the screen shortly. So what is your number one challenge at the moment? Some examples that I've heard in the past are knowing what to focus on, knowing what the market wants, finding investors, finding other sources of funding, finding co-development partners, building a team, or overcoming a technical or scientific challenge. But if you have something else that you feel is your number one challenge at the moment, please feel free to mention it. Excellent. Have around 80% of responses now. And you should be able to see those results on your screen. So number one, we actually have finding other sources of funding, for example, grants. Other front runners are knowing what the market wants, finding investors, and finding co-development partners. So hopefully we're on the right track towards discovering other ways of thinking that can help you to deal with these challenges. Okay. So has anyone heard of the Valley of Death? So the Valley of Death is a concept that describes the resource gap between the point where you have an initial idea or initial invention and the point where you've generated enough evidence to reach proof of concept or to have more confidence that it's going to work, and at which point investors and other backers are much more willing to join you. And if we think back to the main reasons why businesses fail, often running out of money, lack of business development, this is where a lot of them end up in the Valley of Death. So secret number 2 is partnerships shorten the route to your next milestone. Partnerships can help you to escape the Valley of Death, perhaps not in such a fantastical way as we see here, but they can help you to find a more direct path to your next milestone. And I'll give an example of this. So you may have an offering that seems promising, but you may not have a working business model for it. Whereas you could have a partner who does have a working business model that your offering can plug directly into. So that's just one of many examples of how they can shorten your route to the next milestone. And when I say partners, I use the term quite broadly, and I include funding organizations and investors in that. And let's not forget, with a lot of businesses failing due to running out of funds, finding your next partner can mean staying afloat and being able to move closer to your vision. So I have a framework for this, which I call the 4 W's, and like all frameworks based on letters, there is one of the words in there which does not begin with a W. So we have who are our partners, what do they want, why do they want it, and how do they recognize what they want. And this should feel a little bit familiar after the previous framework. And if we go back to that idea of finding your most influential stakeholders, for those of you in the earlier stages, it's often the case that these partners will be your most influential stakeholders. So let's look into this in more detail. So through my many years consulting, I definitely found that this is something that's really crucial for early stage ventures. And the lean startup approach to business, or approach to startups, which is really popular in the software space, they definitely recognize this need for information in general. This man, Steve Blank, many years ago, he came up with the idea of customer development, which urged new startups to get out of the building, get out of the lab, get out of the office, and speak to your customers before you develop your product and during product development. And that was discussed in this book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. One of his proteges, Eric Ries, wrote the book, The Lean Startup, which took a simplified but very similar approach, which talked about this feedback loop of build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, and it really emphasized speaking to your customers as well. Later, he had a book called The Business Model Generation, which proposed the business model canvas, which I really urge early stage companies and also universities to do. And it's basically a way to map out all of the different facets of your business on a single page. When you're getting started, 2 key areas here are your value propositions and your customers. And then I've kind of put a dotted box around the key partners, because before you form a partnership with someone, I actually recommend that you include partners in the key customer segment. And these approaches of customer development and building, measuring, and learning, it's all about getting feedback between these 2 boxes, between what the value you aim to offer is and the value perceived by your customers, or in this particular case, your partners. But remember, information always needs context. So it's not just about what they value, but why they value it, what they're trying to achieve, and how you can demonstrate that you can help them with that. Now, once you do find someone who's looking for a partnership, it becomes simpler. Just remember to ask, what do they want? Why do they want it? And how do they recognize what they want? And this can be as specific as a specific product attribute, especially in healthcare. This can be really key. And it can be specific as a particular experiment, or there may even be a quantitative threshold associated with that. And how has this happened in practice? So we've seen this at Probatech with our work with a university based in the UK. They very cleverly discovered a new class of antimicrobial compounds, but unfortunately the market has been in trouble for many years now, and I'm sure several of you will be aware that there's a creeping health crisis of antimicrobial resistance, which is rendering many of the drugs we currently have available ineffective. In response to this, there has been an increase in the push in the form of funding available for early stage research, but there's not so much of a pull incentive in terms of the commercial incentives in the market. And this has become so severe that two of the companies that have successfully developed and brought new antibiotics to the market in recent years have actually filed for bankruptcy shortly after gaining approval for their new antibiotics. So it's a difficult market and it's difficult to find partners. But our approach here was to work with our client here and first ask who. And with that, we were able to identify around 80 potential partners. And that was much more than was expected. So that was already a useful exercise. But then from that, we shortlisted the best. We reached out to them, and then we made sure to ask what they wanted, why they wanted it, and how we needed to demonstrate this to them. And actually, this exposed a big shortcoming in the product profile of the lead antimicrobial that our client had. But it did give direction to the R&D plan going forward. And I wanted to give this example because this is actually what a shorter route or a shortcut looks like in some cases. It's not going further downfield and then discovering that you have a problem. It's about having to go back to the lab, but then knowing that once you've achieved that change that the market has suggested to you, that you're going to have a group of partners waiting for you saying, come back to us because we're interested, which was the case here. So let's try and bring all of this together. So you start with your vision or opportunity. You need to understand how your stakeholders perceive value, and through that, understand how you can communicate its value. You want to escape the valley of death, so you can connect with partners and find a shorter route to your next milestone. And that can also help you to stay afloat. So with all of that, you might be asking, what could go wrong? Or alternatively, the more pessimistic of you may be suggesting that, well, everything can go wrong. And that's certainly the case in a high technology area. But there is one particular way in which things can go wrong, which I would like to focus on. So this man, Daniel Kahneman, is a Nobel Prize winning psychologist, and he actually won the Nobel Prize for economics. But he described this process where we see just a few elements of something or a few elements of a story. The human brain will construct the best story that it possibly can with those few things that it sees. And he called that Wisiati, or what you see is all there is. And I felt that both this idea and also the vision of an iceberg is a really good depiction of this. Markets are dynamic now more than ever, I'd argue. Things happen, perceptions of value or the context can change, and competition can emerge. And your ability to respond to all of that is limited by what you see, and what you see is all there is. So here's a useful framework for this. I call it Stop, Look and Listen. And for those of you from the UK, you might remember this, but this is what they used to get young children to be careful whilst crossing the road. And it's been forever imprinted on my mind. But I think it's a useful way of thinking of what we need to do here. So first, you need to stop, take a snapshot of your environment, understand how value is perceived, who or what defines value, who the competition are. You need to look, consider what could change, and then listen, find a way to track new events. And to really emphasize how important I think this is, I'd like to share a story from my time in consulting for big pharma companies. So the image here is a representation of the evolution of haemophilia treatments. And at the time I was focused on haemophilia A, which is caused by a lack of the clotting factor 8, which leads to uncontrolled bleeding. So the gold standard of treatment there is to replace clotting factor 8. Now, if we look at this diagram, it shows how initially the factor 8 was derived from blood, and this worked, but it caused all sorts of problems in terms of infections. And in fact, there were some really sad cases where several patients around the world were infected with HIV and hepatitis C. So for a while, the key area of value was around safety. And then over time, with the advent of recombinant technology, the key area of value started to shift. The safety concerns weren't as high, but we still had the issue that these patients had to administer these drugs through intravenous infusions several times a week, which was a huge burden. So a key area of value was around extending the half-life of these factor 8 products, which would lead to less frequent administration. Now, during this time, an emerging competitor arose with a different approach. It was not a factor 8, but it mimicked the activity of factor 8. So it was able to address certain issues whilst not being limited by some of the issues with factor 8. And two key examples of that relate to the half-life. So it seemed like there was some sort of ceiling on the half-life of factor 8. So it wasn't limited in the same way there. And then there was also a propensity for the body to mount an immune response against factor 8, including the endogenous factor 8, which is a huge problem, but something which didn't affect this new drug. So at the time that I came across it, the drug was in phase 2. I told my clients at the time about it, and they weren't aware of it, but they took note of it. And then a year or two passed, and later we were organizing a strategy workshop. And I noticed that Ross, the developer of this drug, was not included in that workshop. And I asked about it, but they were happy not to include it. And then a couple of years passed, and I'm then an independent consultant at this point. And I get calls from different companies at the same time asking, can you please look into emicizumab? But by that point, it was too late. In the space of 2 years, this drug, once it was launched, went from nothing to earning more than $1 billion per year. Or here you can see more than £500 million Swiss francs per quarter, which is huge. And the reason I tell this story is because it's an example of what can happen if you focus on too narrow a segment of the market. You just focus on the what. So in this case, on recombinant clotting factor 8. And also B, if you fail to keep track of things. And obviously you can also turn this story on your head. That emerging competitor could be you, and it could be you that comes with a really different approach. So then the key message there is to, as we've discussed, always focus on the value, not so much on your new approach, but how it helps the various stakeholders to achieve what they wanted to achieve in a way that's better than what's currently available. Okay, so working with multinational pharma companies, I learned that you need to know what you're looking for and know where you're going, know where to look for changes, and develop systems for tracking. And this is really important, not just for huge companies, but it's really important for early stage companies because it allows you to keep track of how your stakeholders are likely to be perceiving value, and it allows you to communicate your value in a way that's up to date and resonates. So how do we put this into practice? So when you stop and take a snapshot of your environment, you need to identify what to watch, whether it's changes in certain guidelines or changes in the competition. And you need to make sure that you do not forget about context of value. Do not have a narrow focus or an overly narrow focus. Then when you look, you need to find out where to watch these things, where to watch for changes. And then finally, listen. You need to find a way to keep watching it. And there are various ways of doing this. You can outsource it, you can build your own systems, and you can subscribe to various updates. Okay, so if we think back to the title of this webinar, Navigating the Maze, I chose that title because when you're starting a new venture, particularly in healthcare, or if you're doing anything that involves high technology, it can feel a bit like a maze. And I hope that the secrets that I've discussed so far can help you to deal with that challenge. But I also recognize that it may feel like a lot of work at the moment. So I have another way of framing this, which may help to simplify things. So if we think about the history of navigation, you started off with a compass and a map. And that was okay. It gives you some direction. It gives you some context in terms of what's around you. But there's a lot of manual work that's necessary there. And then here we have a picture of the first GPS machine. And with the advent of GPS, you had a lot more precision. But as far as I can see with this machine, not so much in the way of context. And now if we think to what we have available today, you have precision about where you are. You have context about your surroundings, which is updated. And then you also have direction on where you need to go. So with the concepts I've shared here, you can start with knowing where you want to go. You can find a way to get there, and you can get more context on your environment. But here's that bonus tip that I promised. You need to make sure that you collate, integrate, and update this information. As I mentioned earlier, Probatech exists to make sure new discoveries are explored to their full potential. We start off by setting a baseline based on how value is perceived in a market and how it's defined in a market. And we identify those stakeholders and understand how they perceive value. We identify who your potential partners are, what they're interested in, why they're interested in it, and how you can attract those partners. And then we help to keep track of changes in the marketplace and in the competition. And either individually or in combination, we integrate those things and we act as your modern GPS. But what I really want to achieve with this webinar is to take these concepts and hopefully have you walk away and be able to implement them yourselves. So let's go through a few reminders. So remember, you need to understand and communicate value. You need to remember that partnerships shorten the route. They can help you to escape the valley of death, show you a more direct route to your next milestone, and also help you to stay afloat. Please remember that what you see is all there is. Things happen, perceptions of value and context can change, and competition can emerge. So when it comes to understanding and communicating value, we discussed the idea of value-based communication. And that urges that you ask, who are the most influential stakeholders? What do they value? Why do they value it? How do they recognize value? And how can I communicate in a language they understand? When looking for partners and investors, you need to ask the 4 W's. So who are our partners? What do they want? Why do they want it? And for me, this is one of the most important aspects. How do they recognize what they want? And if they can be specific, then you want to know it down to the specifics here. And finally, remember that what you see is all there is. So you need to stop, look, and listen. Take a snapshot of how things are today. consider what could change, and find a way to track new events. And remember, keep collating, integrating, and updating that information. So I'd like to congratulate you again on all being part of such a supportive program as Imagine If. And I'd also like to remind you that there is a competition aspect to this program as well. And if I understand correctly, part of how you'll be judged is on your potential as a company. And if I remember this correctly, you have until June for the local finals. So if you forget all of the metaphors and conceptual ideas and only take away a few things away from this webinar, please remember that you need to know your stakeholders and understand how they perceive value so that you can communicate that value back to them. You need to find out who your partners are, what they want to see, why they want to see it, and importantly, how they want to see it. You need to know your competition and keep track of the broader context. And remember that you need to collate, integrate, and update your knowledge, not just the knowledge of the external, but then also when you're putting together, it could be a non-confidential summary, it could be a pitch deck, that also needs to be updated to match the current context. And one more thing you can do to boost your chances in just 30 minutes is to take advantage of the booking system, where I'll be available for one-to-one sessions, along with the other sponsors and mentors in this program. You can also reach out to me by email, or you can connect with me or follow the company on LinkedIn. But for now, I'd just like to thank you all for your time. And if you have any questions, I think we can take a few before we run out of time. Thank you very much. Okay, and please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can also put a question into the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Aram. Please, anyone, if you have any questions, don't hesitate.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation, Aram. That was really very clear. Can you talk a little bit about the customer, or maybe I should say the end user as a stakeholder, and any strategies for, having a value conversation, especially when they're segmented, in different categories. So do you mind just expanding a little bit on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try my best. And one thing that is really worth doing here is trying to understand whether that end user has much say on whether they use your product or not. So my bias is from the pharmaceutical space and the healthcare space, and it's often the case in that scenario that the end user doesn't have much say. That can change from disease to disease, but sometimes it's actually the doctor or the nurse who has a say, and sometimes they don't have a say. There might be a hospital formulary committee that decides which drugs are used in which situations. Above that, you may have a healthcare payer like the NHS, or within that, you may have a health technology association. So what you need to do is to try and map out all of the different stakeholders and discover who has the most say over whether your product or offering is used or not. And then through that, that kind of gives you that most influential group, and they're the ones who it is most important to understand how they perceive value. Now, as I mentioned, healthcare is really complicated because the patient needs are also really important. So even if the end user is not the most influential in terms of the buyer, you need to understand whether the patient needs and the patient's concerns, or the end user's needs and concerns, filter up to those other stakeholders too. And if that's true, then you really need to include them in your priority group in terms of reaching out to them and understanding how they perceive value. So that was my initial thought on that, but yeah, feel free to ask any more questions if that hasn't fully answered your question.
That was perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a quick question then? Aram, hi. I mean, we'll talk again soon, I think. But I was interested when you were talking about what you see as all there is in the keeping, you know, informed about the space and the competition and everything that's happened. You mentioned, you know, maybe sign up for mailing lists or newsletters or anything like that. Are any particular tools that you recommend to make sure that you stay informed about the space?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't recommend one tool that would cover everything. But if you can focus on who is a great curator of information in your industry, then they are likely to pick up the most impactful events. So that's one level. If we can be a bit more detailed than that, if you're targeting a specific use case or specific disease, then you may want to understand who has a lot of influence over how that disease is managed. And hopefully you can extrapolate this to other types of businesses. And once you understand that, you often find that there are certain committees or professional organizations, or there may actually be government organizations that will publish guidelines on how you treat a certain disease. So that is one example of the type of thing that you might want to subscribe to, or at least check periodically to make sure. In healthcare as well, the regulation can actually be helpful because it forces a lot of information into the same place. So once drugs are in clinical trials, there are regulations around registering those clinical trials in publicly accessible databases. And the most famous and the most complete and useful of those is one called clinicaltrials.gov. Some of you may know that already, but I'm just going to put that into the chat. And that's a place that you want to go either once you know who your competition are, you can go and search that database, and you can identify any trials that are going on involving your competition, and then you can actually track those trials and receive email updates or RSS feed updates. Or the other thing you can do is you can just use keywords related to your area or indication of interest, and you can receive updates based on that search. So when a new trial appears, or perhaps if a trial that matches that search is updated, that can be another place to look. And certainly there are a few other examples that we can discuss in our sessions as well.
Great.
Okay, it looks like we have no other questions, but I'm sure some questions may arise later. As I mentioned, I'll be available through the appointment system. You can book a one-to-one session with me, or even if you have a quick question, please don't be shy. Feel free to drop me an email and I'll be happy to respond.
Thank you so much, Hiram, for all of this, for the availability. It was a super great presentation. Oh, someone is asking if they can get your slides somewhere.
Yeah, I think that, am I right in that you're recording this, so then you'll be able to provide everyone with access?
Yes, definitely.
I'll also prepare the slides and I'll arrange with you to share it with everyone. We can do that too.
Perfect. Okay then. Yeah.
Looks like we're about to finish dead on time. It's 6:29 in UK time.
So perfect Swiss punctuality, actually.
Okay, great.
Okay, Dan. Right. Thanks to Hiram. It was great to have you here today, virtually here. And thanks everyone for joining and participating in the webinar. Good luck to all the Imagine-If participants, and successful developments to you all.